Okay, I think we might get started. Um, Welcome everybody. Um, I'm Kat Young-Nicol. I'm a senior lecturer in the sociology department at Goldsmiths University of London. And together with Becky Coleman, who is a reader in the sociology department here also at Goldsmiths, we are delighted to welcome you all to today's event. It's really great that you can join us. We know that we've got lots of people from a range of different places in also different time zones, some earlier than later. And so it's just really fantastic to have such a wide range of people. And that's one of the great benefits of Zoom events. And we do welcome you on behalf of two research centres. The event is hosted by Methods Lab and also by POP. I'll introduce POP and then I'll hand over to Becky briefly to introduce Methods Lab. So POP is short for Politics of Patents, and it's a European Research Council funded research project. We're doing a socio-history of 200 years of clothing inventions to explore how past and present inventors have used and are using new forms of clothing to resist, subvert, or disrupt kind of socio and political norms and beliefs, and in the process bring new forms of citizenship into being. It's also about trying out new inventive practice research methods. So we're getting to reconstruct, perform, and wear in a whole range of these stories in amazing costumes. So I'll just hand over to Becky briefly to say a little bit about what we're doing within Methods Lab.
Hi, and just to echo Kat, thanks very much for coming. It's really nice to see some familiar people, some familiar names and new names as well. Yeah, I'm just going to say a few words about Methods Lab, which, as Kat said, is a research centre. It's based in the sociology department at Goldsmiths. If you know anything about our department, it's very interdisciplinary, and one of the things that Methods Lab does is it provides a space and a platform for experimenting with and expanding our kind of understanding of and our practice with methods. So this includes working in very interdisciplinary ways, so with methods from art, design and the humanities, as well as from the social sciences, and also experimenting with ways of sharing and circulating research. So that includes, I guess, the kind of standard textual outputs of research, but also exhibitions, videos, podcasts, poems. So we're kind of interested in how we can share these research experiments as well. We have a new Methods Lab book series, which will include standard books around method and methodological experimentation, as well as non-standard outputs. So you can have a look at our website, the Methods Lab website, which Chloe has put in the chat, the link there. And there's lots more information there, and there'll be more on the series as we get going. But yeah, just to say thanks again for being here, and I'm really looking forward to this talk.
Thanks, Becky. Yeah, we're incredibly thrilled to have the person that I'm now going to introduce, who we're here to see. We very warmly welcome Professor Shahidha Bari, who also ran for us a fantastic workshop this morning. Some of you were at. There was lots of discussion about the possibilities and the challenges of writing, about the power of small details and different forms of attention. And also we talked about kind of the various shapings of our disciplinary trainings. It was very inspiring, and we could have done that all day, I think, but we tried to keep it curtailed to a few hours this morning because obviously we've got, she very generously is doing 2 events for us today. So thank you very much in advance for that. But we were just so thrilled to have Professor Bari kind of involved in doing work for, doing these talks for both POP and for Methods Lab, because she comes from a background of philosophy and literary theory and is now a professor of fashion cultures and histories at London College of Fashion at the University of Arts London. She's incredibly multi-talented. She works as an academic, as a critic and a broadcaster, and has won multiple awards for her writing and poetry. Worked with the BBC, The Guardian, The Times Literary Supplement, Frieze magazine, amongst many others. And as many of you, I'm sure, will know, she's the author of the fantastic book, Dressed: The Secret Life of Clothes, which tracks the hidden power of clothes in our culture and daily lives via literature, art, film, and philosophy. And it's just so beautifully written. So we're very much looking forward to her lecture, which she's going to obviously introduce and tell us more about in just a second. I just wanted to say very quickly, we have permission from Shahidha to record this lecture, but we won't be recording the Q&A afterwards. So we're envisioning that she will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open this up to more kind of discussion and questions that we welcome you to put into the chat throughout the lecture, and then Becky and I will have a look at that and help to kind of chair that after the lecture. So again, thank you very much for joining us, and I'll now hand over to Shahidha for the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, that's such a very kind introduction, Katrina and Rebecca. Thank you. And I'm really delighted that you invited me to come talk with you this afternoon. And it's especially delightful because as I'm learning, the Methods Lab at Goldsmiths and the Politics of Patents project are such truly exciting enterprises, with what I take to be a genuinely experimental research ethos behind it. And this is why I blame you for what's happened with my lecture today. In time-honored fashion, I've ended up writing a lecture that is absolutely removed from the one I intended and the one that I blurbed. I think I had this idea I was going to talk to you about speculative realism and Quentin Meillassoux and new frontiers in material, like quite a hard philosophy and spacesuits. And I still want to write that lecture for you, so you have to invite me back for it. But as I was writing, I was thinking about the experimental and how you guys value the experimental. I started to think that the experimental is not just the new. The experimental is about the past, is about how we handle the past, actually, in many ways, not just about the future of our studies, but how we think about the past. And I went backwards rather than forwards, which is unlike me, but perhaps you'll be patient. And if you are interested in Quentin Meillassoux and materialism and speculative realism, I'm really happy to talk to you about that. But I apologize if that's what you expected, because what I've done instead is I've been thinking at length about the idea of the experimental. So if I may, I'm going to talk about this notion of the experiment, first of all, and I'll get to dress and the reading of material culture in a slightly circuitous way, so I hope you can bear with it. So let me preface this by observing that the willingness to experiment, in terms of how we conduct research and what we research, those are ideas with which I have great sympathy, and I think many of us have great sympathy right now in this very important moment of radical social and cultural and historical reckoning. And this is exemplified, I think, in the conversations we have about the kinds of histories we tell in particular. And many of us are asking, whose histories are we telling? Whose stories are occluded and whose narratives are minimized? And those are good questions to ask. But the question of what we research can only be diversified and deepened and broadened if we're also willing to experiment in the methods of our research. If we open up the conventionally narrow ways of research methodology, querying our orthodoxies. And to my mind, that means finding new ways of understanding cultural objects, drawing out wider connections, maybe even wider than we might have anticipated, and curating material culture in fresh ways. And perhaps I can try to get to that. But let me start by talking about experiments in the more conventional sense, as we have once known it. So I'm going to start with Joseph Wright of Derby, which I hope you can see. I think you can. This is Joseph Wright of Derby's experiment with the bird in an air pump from 1768. So yes, I'm going back rather than forward. Very possibly, like me, you know this image well. If you live in London or near London, you may have visited it over the years, where it lives at the National Gallery. And the painting, you will know, depicts a scientist, or what would have been known at the time as a natural philosopher, conducting a public experiment to an audience of onlookers, each of whom seems to respond differently. The room is darkened. Each face is uplit differently by a candle on the table and the cool moonlight beaming in from the top far right of the painting. I'll come back to the moon. I'm really interested in space at the moment and images of the moon, but I'm going to come back to the moon in this paper too. But for the time being, let's just note that Joseph Wright, along with a number of his peers, including Joseph Priestley and Josiah Wedgwood, were members of the Lunar Society. And the moon here is perhaps a quiet symbolic wink towards that. Essentially, the Lunar Society was a gentleman's dining club and a learned society comprising of prominent figures in the British Midlands, industrialists, natural philosophers and intellectuals. And they would meet regularly between 1765 and 1813. And the name Lunar Society arose because the society would meet on the night of a full moon, since the extra light made the journey home easier and safer in the absence of street lighting. And the members cheerfully referred to themselves as lunatics, a pun on lunatics. And perhaps you do need a degree of eccentricity to truly enter into the spirit of an experiment. Now, the particular experiment in this image is the bird in the air pump, and it's an old experiment, even in 1768 when it's depicted here. Wright's philosopher, or the scientist, conducts this experiment in a rather wild-eyed way. He's a performing conjurer, a magician, rather than a scientist, investigating the effects of oxygen deprivation. And the gesture he makes with his left hand too is redolent of that. There's a kind of theatrical finger snapping to come at any moment as he readies to release the stopcock valve and reoxygenate the vessel, or not, so that the bird may live or not, who knows. Now, I predictively have always been really fascinated by his costume, and I once suggested on Twitter that he bears, I'll go back actually, that he bears a striking resemblance to the haggard and roguish 90s nightclub owner Peter Stringfellow, and I got terribly chastised for suggesting this by art historians. But I think I'm right to observe that he is dressed in what seems a theatrical or flamboyant way. The art historian Marieke de Winkel, in her study of Rembrandt, calls garments like this a tabard, not to be confused with the medieval tabard, the sleeveless tunic. Rather, this is tabard double B double A. I don't have the Dutch pronunciation. I'm assuming it's tabard. It's an item of men's clothing originating in 15th century Dutch men's fashion. And it takes the form of a large gown or robe with long hanging open sleeves. And it's often made of sumptuous materials such as brocade or fur. This is essentially a gentleman's dressing gown, sometimes known as a nachttabard, or a night gown, essentially. And it was worn by educated men. It was a luxurious house garment in which you might casually receive guests. And so here Wright is receiving his guests in Derby in a darkened domestic interior for this public demonstration. And I think it's a mark of his insouciance, his informality, his infinite confidence that he does so in this garment. He is handling life and death, but he has no trouble doing it. Now, the experiment he is conducting is modelled on the vacuum experiments of the Anglo-Irish chemist physicist Robert Boyle, in which a bird is deprived of air before a varied group of onlookers. Here's Boyle on the left-hand side looking spectacular at the National Portrait Gallery. Boyle claimed to be, this is a quote, unprepossessed by any of the modern theories of philosophy or science until he could be provided of experiments to help him judge of them. And so the experiment was for him this essential thing, essential to the establishment of knowledge. And the bird in an air pump experiment here involves a bird trapped in a vessel. It requires a device that extracts the air from the vessel and causes the creature to gradually asphyxiate and collapse in the subsequent vacuum. Now, interestingly, Boyle had commissioned the construction of a pneumatic engine in 1659, better known as an air pump, precisely to observe the physiological processes of living creatures at reduced barometric pressures. And in Wright's painting, the gentleman in the foreground left at the bottom of this cut of the painting, who seems to be holding a watch in his hand, perhaps timing the exact tolerance of the bird before it begins to asphyxiate, closely observes the experiment with precisely this air of objective scientific detachment. But others in the group, of course, exhibit a variety of different reactions. There are the two lovers next to him. I say lovers in inverted commas. She is certainly absorbed by her companion, gazing adoringly into his face and indifferent to the scientific scene, while he, well, I'm never quite sure if he's reciprocating. Maybe you can tell me what you think. There's something about the casual disarray of the green stripy lapels of his jacket, which seemed to suggest to me a certain caddishness, a vanity perhaps. This is not, I hasten to say, a scientific observation for me. This is just a hunch. But when I look at his gaze, I'm not entirely sure that he's meeting hers. The younger boy in between them, between the man holding the watch and the couple in the lower left, squeezing in next to them, he's snuck in a little illicitly, I imagine, perhaps unaccompanied. He tilts his head up eagerly, leaning in that boyishly ghoulish way to catch a glimpse of the bird in what might be its final throes. What I'm trying to say here is that this is an image full of interest, of course, but I want to ask you to attend to two very particular things. First of all, the two girls on the right-hand side of the painting, they sit low to the table's candlelight source, and so they are the most illuminated figures in this image. They demand our attention, even as they are the smallest figures in the painting too, apart from the bird. The two girls might be sisters with their clean silk gowns and strands of beads or pearls in their hair. Let's see if I don't think I can come closer yet. But what is it about their clothes that tells us that they are eminently well loved for? It's clear to me that they are cared for, they're pampered perhaps, enough even to have been bought by the father perhaps above them, who has brought them along to this clever little entertainment. Wright is so attentive to their dress that he even takes pains to catch their reflection in the surface of the table. So you can see the sleeve of the dress is captured in the glossy reflection of the table. And this seems to me, perhaps this is an annoying thing to have jagged my attention, but it seems to me so peculiar. It's such an unnecessary detail. It's only caught by the most careful eye, and it's all the more precious for it. It's worth remembering that Derby, where this painting is set, Joseph Wright of Derby, had been a significant centre for silk making since the late 17th century, during this period of fashionable demand for luxury silk items, a demand which was met in part by the Huguenot refugees from France who had settled in England. In Derby, though, around about Wright's time, we see the development of commercial silk manufacture using water-powered machinery. And in fact, the Derby Silk Mill is now the local museum of industry. There's lots to find out about that mill. I could talk to you for ages about it, but I won't. But it seems to me really important that these little girls with their sashes of blue silk around the waist and the headband that are so beautifully rendered, it seems really important to me that they're beautifully rendered, because they are at the crux of this historical moment in which the relationship between British industrial production, refugee labour and imported goods are powerfully shifting. But here, the girls here are also very clearly, very obviously distressed by the scene they're witnessing. One of the girls cowers, she shields her eyes, but it's the other who interests me the most, because she is tremblingly peering up. You can see in this close-up, there is the tiniest tear pooling at the edge of her left eyelid at the very bottom of it. If you've ever seen children weep, that's what it looks like, the little crystal at the edge of their eyelid, just trembling. And I'm most interested in her and the fact that she doesn't look away, even though she clearly wants to. I'm also interested in her clutching hand, the way that it tightly grips her sister's dress, holding on for dear life. Now, I have an older sister, so I know precisely what that grasp is, although it's some decades since I was a child holding on to my older sister's skirts. But I suspect some of you might know it too. You'll know the thinness of the material, the precariousness of that hot, slippery hand grasping desperately, the way the fingers curl into the darkness of the folds. This is, or this could be, what the French philosopher Roland Barthes would call the punctum of this painting. In his 1980 study of photography, Camera Lucida, Bart pores over one particular image of his mother as a child. She's decked in a stiff white dress from under which peep the smallest boots. And over the course of the book, he delineates an idea of the punctum or puncture point, which I'm sure many of you know about. The puncture or the punctum is the detail in any given picture that penetrates and by which we establish a relationship with the object or person represented to us. The punctum is the pinprick that startles, the particular point in an image that opens it up, suddenly permitting us to see more deeply and to understand differently. And searching this grey and grainy photograph of his mother, Bart finds the punctum in what he calls her unbearably small hands, observing how she holds one finger in the other hand, as children often do in an awkward gesture. To my mind, there's also something in the fullness of her dress and the scuffed shoes too, a certain innocence that wounds us again and again. But to come back to Wright's experiments and the girl, let me find her, and the young girl who dreads to watch and yet cannot turn her gaze, perhaps this is the best kind of experiment, where we test the limits of what we can bear to see. And perhaps this is what the father who comforts the older daughter is instructing here. Perhaps he is saying, come now, have faith in this experiment, dare to see the truth out to its finale, because perhaps everything will come right in the end. Now, the second image that I want to ask you to attend to is in this rather circuitous meditation on experimenting, forgive me, it will get somewhere, is this mysterious cloudy inchoate shape that seems to have formed in the specimen jar at the low center of the image. And it's this that preoccupies the older gentleman in the lower right corner of the painting, and his very far away gaze seems to intimate graver reflections. The received reading is to suggest that he sees this as a skull, or the shape of a skull, forming in the specimen jar. And so this serves as a memento mori, the reminder that death is everywhere and always coming. And perhaps that would account for the solemnity of his expression, and it would accord with his age too. The young girl fears for the bird's life, but perhaps he fears for his own. The other suggestion is a little odder, and that is that this is a lung of some form, not human. Lungs are the elastic kind of organ you might find in a small animal, and which could be inflated and deflated as part of an air pump experiment. In fact, the Scottish scientist James Ferguson, whom Wright would have known, used to stage demonstrations precisely of this kind, only he would have used a small small air-filled animal bladder. So what if this is a lung, not a bladder and not a skull, but a lung? Perhaps it makes no significant difference to the somber mood of this painting, the enormous skill and precision with which it's executed, but we read images and objects, we feel them and we think them, and our new readings and feelings for them yield new associations and new contexts. Isn't this, in fact, what we're always searching for, the connections between things that emerge over time, sometimes large spans of time, things that surface to prompt us to see the continuities of our very long histories. Let me remind you then that this is the experiment with an air pump, that air is everything in this image. The bird is dying from the lack of it. The sobbing girl is probably gulping for it, swallowing big, tearful breaths in distress. The young boy is exhaling, he's probably gasping in excitement. Perhaps you and I too are holding our breath as we watch this scene unfold, as this image utterly absorbs our attention. This is a scene about air, its lack, its release, its withholding, and its relief. Wright is interested in pneumatics, and this is why he paints the air pump with mechanical precision. But he himself suffered from various illnesses that affected his respiratory system, including spasmodic asthma. So what does it mean that this artist knew what it was like to be like this bird, to be dangerously, terrifyingly, catastrophically short of breath? The Latin word for breath is spiritus, and our English term inspiration stems from it, and the verb spirare, to breathe. I'm going to come back to inspiration and asphyxiation again and again in this paper. What is it to depict a scene that is simultaneously one of inspiration and asphyxiation? And isn't there a difference between holding our breath and our breath being withheld from us? If all this sounds a bit elliptical, perhaps it helps to return to, for a moment, to Wright's moon in the corner of that painting and the Lunar Society, the learned gentlemen's dining club meeting on those moonlit nights in Birmingham in the 18th century, and all those industrialists, natural philosophers and intellectuals who would talk about science and knowledge, new technologies and ancient planets alike. This is the gilded statue of Boulton Watt, I think it might be Priestley, I can't remember, outside the register office on Broad Street in Birmingham. If you're from Birmingham, you will recognise it. A great deal of the historical study of the Lunar Society has attended to the enormously important scientific and industrial achievements of its members. People like Matthew Boulton, the great manufacturer of steam engines and the supplier to the Royal Mint, whose modern minting techniques forged millions of coins for Britain and its colonies. His partner, James Watt, the great engineer and chemist after whom the SI unit of power, the Watt, in fact, is named. Joseph Priestley, the chemist and theologian, credited with the discovery of oxygen and the invention of carbonated water. Erasmus Darwin, the English physician and father of Charles Darwin. And Josiah Wedgwood, the potter, entrepreneur, industrialist, and philanthropist. Philanthropy is where I'm getting to. The Lunar Society was progressive. It was politically and socially progressive, and it played a role in the long campaign for the abolition of slavery in Britain. It was Wedgwood who produced the medallions that would become iconic artifacts of the abolition campaign, depicting an enslaved person kneeling and enchained, appealing with the simple motto, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And he asked his senior craftsman, William Hackwood, to model what was to become the most important symbol of the abolitionist movement, the small cameo and the supplication. This one became the seal of the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade when it was founded in 1787. Now, Wedgwood produced the slavery medallions at his own expense, and he freely distributed them. One notable batch was sent to Benjamin Franklin in 1788, and a copy of Josiah Wedgwood's accompanying letter exists in the museum, Wedgwood Museum archives. And there he explains, the more the subject, I'm paraphrasing here, he says something like, the more the subject of freedom is canvassed, he uses that word, the better it would be understood. In short, the more that objects like this are circulated, the more we raise awareness, he means, the better chance we have of changing this. And it's a familiar enough argument. Perhaps you too have worn a pink or red or yellow ribbon pinned to your coat, or you have a wristband dedicated to a cause. You might even be wearing the black and red ribbon of the Black Lives Matter movement at the moment. But let me come back to that in a moment. In the late 18th century, Britain was the most significant slave trading nation in the world. Simply put, the transatlantic slave trade, the triangular route from Europe to Africa to the Americas and back to Europe, entailed the transit of goods in return for enslaved Africans. And in their journey across the Atlantic to the American colonies, Africans were sold for sugar, tobacco, cotton, and more, sold to work as slaves on plantations and in positions of domestic servitude. Now, Britain, together with Portugal, accounted for about 70% of all Africans transported to the Americas. Between 1640 and 1807, across the period of Wright's painting, it's estimated that the British transported 3.1 million Africans. They transported 3.1 million Africans, of whom 2.7 million arrived to the British colonies in the Caribbean, North and South America. And anti-slavery campaigners lobbied for 20 years more to end the trade, and the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act was passed in Britain actually tomorrow on the 25th of March in 1807. This decreed the illegality of the purchase, sale, barter, or transfer of enslaved persons. Although it was, if you know the story, the original act was ineffective in dissuading slavers from the economic incentives of slavery. And it wasn't until the financial sanctions and the reparations of the later act in 1834 and in the subsequent years that slavery was more effectively abolished. Now, the next images I'm going to show you are distressing, but they are images that you may know too. I'm sure, in fact, you do. The 18th century slave ship was essentially a floating suffocation chamber. It choked men and women, sucking the air from their lungs. The design of these slave ships was intended to restrain the enslaved with chains and shackles, but many died en route by disease and malnutrition for lack of air. Only a few descriptions of the barbaric transit have survived, and they point to extreme claustrophobia. The ship I went aboard of, a Franciscan friar records on his way back from a mission in Congo in 1667, was loaded with elephants' teeth and slaves to the number of 680 men, women and children pressed together like herrings in a barrel, which caused an intolerable heat and stench. The voyages generally lasted between 30 to 35 days. I'm sure lots of you know this image too. This is J.M.W. Turner's The Slave Ship from 1840, significantly later than Wright's. It was originally titled Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying - Typhon Coming On. And it depicts a ship careening tumultuously in a sea of churning water as the blazing sun sets. And in the foreground, you can see scattered human forms floating in its wake. And when you pause to inspect further, you can discern bold black lines, manacled arms that are valiantly held aloft in this water. These are figures gulping for air, impossible to swim, impossible eventually to breathe. Turner seems to have read about the notorious slave ship Zong, the crew of that ship having missed their port in the Caribbean and subsequently running out of provisions, threw 130 captives overboard, presumably in manacles, so that the owners could claim insurance over their lost property. It was a massacre that was eventually taken to trial and a significant landmark in the longer campaign for the abolition of slavery. I'm sure you know at least some of this history, but I think it's remarkable to understand that this is what Wedgwood's image, let me go back to the image. This is what Wedgwood's image, this endlessly reproduced cameo, is up against. The image became a popular symbol of the commitment to abolition. It was widely adopted as decorative embellishment. Importantly, it was worn. It was on snuff boxes, it was on brooches and coat buttons. Thomas Clarkson, the leading abolitionist of the time, who visited the Lunar Society in 1837, described its widespread use. Some had them inlaid in gold on the lid of their snuff boxes. Of the ladies, several wore them in bracelets, and others had them fitted up in an ornamental manner as pins for their hair. At length, the taste for wearing them became general, and thus fashion, which usually confines itself to worthless things, which is a bit rude, was seen for once in the honourable office of promoting the cause of justice, humanity, and freedom. Snuff boxes, cameos, bracelets, pins, also teacups and saucers. There's a necklace in the very right corner. A number of these you can see in London at the Docklands Museum of Slavery. It's worth acknowledging the domestic nature of these objects, their femininity, and the idea even if colonizing and empire building was the work of men, then politics and morality could also be the domain of women, that they too would have their part in the dissemination of an idea and the communal upholding of a value. You could wear the brooch on your chest, you could put the pin in your hair. Think of the two girls in Wright's painting who are distressed, who can hardly bear to watch, but they are learning how to watch too, learning that they must confront suffering. Interestingly, although the industrialists of the Lunar Society had complicated relationships with the transatlantic slave trade, some of them were profiting certainly, it was their daughters who seem to have taken the cause very seriously indeed. Figures like Mary Ann Galton here, she was the daughter of Lunar Society member Samuel Galton Jr., and she wrote about the treatment of enslaved people firsthand, observing, "My father had a very large acquaintance with the aftermath of West Indian merchants of Liverpool. They were mostly kindly, generous and hospitable. Their houses were like palaces. I was amazed to see the sumptuous drawing rooms, rich with satin and silk, in houses where there was no library. What surprised me most was the multitude of black servants, almost all of whom had originally been slaves. This deeply moved my compassion." What's interesting here is the intersection of gender and race, the domestic economy in which slavery is made manifest, both in the objects produced by the violence of empire, the stuff that we get, the commerce of silk and satin, the cottons and the sugars in genteel homes, but also in the symbolic currencies of a material culture, the protest pins and brooches, which had a part to play in the dissemination of a cause. Let's return to Wright's image for a moment, his experiment. All of this, what I've recounted here, is not to say that Wright's image is about slavery. I don't believe that. It is a painting about an experiment with a bird in an air pump. But all images are part of a wider and longer global history. The question for us who gaze upon it is how to broaden our lens, sharpen our attention to see what else is happening around this scene. Because like all scenes, it is the product of a cumulative and continuous historical moment. We can ask, where have those silks and pearls, this Dutch-style nachtabad, come from? What patterns of consumption and global industry by which have they arrived here? We can look at those girls and ask, where are the women in this story? What are they kept from? What can they not bear to look at and yet insist that they do? We can look at the bird in the cage and ask, who else is caged and voiceless in this moment of history? When we watch it asphyxiate, can we ask who else is struggling to breathe? Let me move away now from Wright's experiment, finally, and to talk a little bit more about dress, history and fashion studies. But I want to develop some of those themes that we took from Wright and this context of the transatlantic slave trade. The struggle to breathe and the role of, or the place of material objects and dress objects in particular, both as the product of colonial exploitation and the means for a political critique and political consciousness. And I want to fast forward, really quite forward, to 2016. I want to mention the work done by one of my colleagues at UAL, Professor Carol Tulloch, whose 2016 study, The Birth of Cool, is just such a remarkable work and experimental in many ways too, in thinking about the style narratives of the African diaspora. And I recommend it to you strongly if you don't already know it. In one of the chapters in this book, she reflects on a t-shirt designed by a South African brand called Stoned Cherry. And the t-shirt features the image of Stephen Bantu Biko, known as Steve Biko. He was a key figure in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa during the 1970s, and he was killed in police custody in 1977. It's 2006 when Tulloch first stumbles upon this t-shirt in a department store in Johannesburg. The first thing I saw, she explains, was the face of Steve Biko on a t-shirt in a blend of mustard, yellow and claret. I couldn't actually find an online image that matched the one that Carol described. So here is my nearest approximation, which is I think a later version of the same Stoned Cherry brand. And Tulloch describes it with great detail. She says it's a fitted t-shirt in a women's South African size 14. It's 59 centimeters in length. It rests on the top of the hips, mustard for the body and trim, on the edge of the sleeves with a burgundy accent for the neckline. It's made of viscose and spandex with a scoop neckline. It's fitted at the waist. She describes the embroidered label. I don't think I've got the embroidered label. Perhaps I forgot to add that. But the label indicates to her that it's part of South African designers at Woolworths, the particular range. And she describes the Biko portrait in detail too. It's not simply a candid family photo. This is a screen printed reproduction of a photograph of Biko taken from a magazine cover, a magazine called Drum, from November 1977. And it's a photograph that has been widely in circulation before it ends up on this t-shirt. The t-shirt makes a point of the image's photographic reproduction status. It retains the frame of the white border. And when Carol looks even more closely, she notices that the issue chosen for this reproduction is not an immaculate copy. The screen printing picks up the rubbed and worn areas of the magazine. This is an image that has passed through many hands before it's ended up on this t-shirt. The Drum magazine cover was published in November, just 2 months after Biko was murdered by police on September the 12th, 1977, while in detention without trial. And it's important that this t-shirt records the way that this image proliferated, the way that this magazine cover was passed from household to household, how the cover might have been torn off and pinned on walls, commemorating this man's death. What I mean to say is this is not a static reproduction, but an image that has acquired meaning and emotion in a particular moment of time. When Carol encounters it again in 2006, she asks, does it acquire new resonances in a post-apartheid South Africa? She thinks it does. It gives her a way of understanding the narratives of African diaspora. And she thinks about how a T-shirt might be the way to tell that history. These are inscribed signs of cultural memory, she says. Objects reuse, materialize, concretize, represent or symbolize ideas and memories. And through these processes, objects enable abstract ideas to be grasped. Objects enable abstract ideas to be grasped. They perpetuate and disseminate social values. Objects have this capacity to carry this. That was in 2006. So it's a curious thing, I think, to return to this T-shirt in 2020, 2021, in the wake of the death of another recent Black man in police custody, many Black men in police custody, really. For Tulloch, the thing that I want to draw out from this essay, which really struck me when I reread it last year with my students, is that the T-shirt helps her to think about the concept of struggle. The struggle, she writes, that permeated the life and death of apartheid activism, the struggle that continued before, during and after apartheid, the struggle of those who survived. When she looks up struggle in the Oxford English Dictionary, she finds that it means, I quote, a continued effort to resist, force or free oneself from constraint, a strong effort against difficulties. Struggle is also a strong effort to continue to breathe. Struggle is the strong effort to continue to breathe, which was utterly haunting to me to read it in 2020. This T-shirt, she explains, is a relentlessly politicizing thing. Clothes like a screen-printed T-shirt, material culture, snuff boxes, hairpins, brooches, an image torn from a magazine cover and pinned to a wall. Material culture is a relentlessly politicizing thing. In our own times, of course, the phrase "I can't breathe" has become associated with police violence and is a familiar rallying cry amongst Black Lives Matter activists. Activists, protesters, ordinary citizens carry these signs and chant "I can't breathe" in an effort to draw attention to police violence and brutality. It is also reflective of a longer history of Black asphyxiation, dating at least from the period of the transatlantic slave trade. Daniel Dominguez da Silva from the Washington Post wrote earlier this year that the prison cell and the police chokehold have become the most visible iterations of how Black asphyxiation continues to shape American life. I can't breathe represents much more than a cry for help during a critical moment of someone's life. It also evokes the long and painful history of Black exploitation and marginalization, echoing straight from the bowels of slave ships, which I think is, of course, chilling. But maybe we should catch our breath for a moment. Let me switch gears slightly because I think all of this is quite overwhelming. The question for me is, who is struggling to breathe in 2021? Black men and women in police custody, subject to state violence, yes. Young women protesting in civic parks for the right to move through their streets unassaulted, yes. And of course, in the last year, it turns out that in different ways and to different degrees, many people have been struggling to breathe. And there is nothing equalizing about this vulnerability. We know this is a disease that has been decidedly prejudiced and disproportionately affecting those who are most vulnerable, the elderly, those in low-income jobs that don't permit safe social distancing and increase exposure, those who live in multiple occupancy households, people of color, people with pre-existing conditions and disabilities. And I want to think for a moment about the role of dress in our COVID-19 crisis. I think this work is going to come in the coming years, and it's going to be incredibly interesting. We know already about the staggering failure of provision of personal protective clothing for all medical staff that has left healthcare workers so devastatingly vulnerable, of course, but also how the mask, whether it's a medical grade mask, whether it's a disposable mask, a handmade mask, whether it's fashioned in impromptu style or fashioned as a statement in all the shapes and forms it now comes, how the mask has become a battleground, apparently, between the assertion of civil liberty and acts of communal care. How unthinkingly we rummage for masks now when we leave the house, finding them commonly scrunched in our jacket pockets or folded in a purse. How suddenly they've become an essential item, as indispensable as your keys, your wallet, your comb. How our hedges are littered with them now if you walk down your street. How our eyes have grown accustomed to that flash of medical blue in a sea of people. But let me ask you this. Will we have forgotten about this in 2, 3, 5 years' time, when one day you are waiting in the dentist clinic and you see that flash of blue again, the masked face peering down and asking you to open wide? Will we relegate this to a distant memory? Or will the experience of COVID-19 have transformed us permanently? This period where we have been estranged and deprived of our sense of touch, where ordinary material objects like toilet paper and hand sanitizer have grown bizarre with inflated value, will all our experiences of material goods, of objects themselves, have been irreversibly changed? I don't know the answer to that question. I'd like to know what you think. But me tell you about this. This is a shoe made by an artist called Caroline Chow, and I'm very grateful to Caroline for sharing it with me. She made it at the start of COVID-19, the lockdown, the first lockdown. Perhaps you could tell. She's used tissue, some sort of patterned kitchen roll for the shank, and a thermometer for the stiletto. And it was part of a design project to think about the role of fashion during the pandemic. She was thinking about the toilet roll shortages at the beginning, how everyone was rushing around to hoard supplies. And she was thinking about medical personnel working through the pandemic. In a crisis like the one we're coming through now, does the significance of our material objects change? One of the most interesting things about this piece, to my mind, is that it is beautiful. I don't know if you agree, but I think it's so lovely. It's taken fairly ordinary functional materials and fashioned something elegant and serene. And these objects, a thermometer and a kitchen towel, are not usually beautiful. Their purpose is use. By the same token, the purpose of a stiletto isn't usually use either. They're hard to walk in. We often intend to accomplish something else than use, it seems to me, in wearing stilettos. So what is Chow doing here? I think she's asking us to think about the nature of fashion objects and their relationship to use. She's also asking us to think about the nature of practical objects and their relationship to beauty. And more than that, she's doing it with a wry sense of humor. She's gently mocking both of those categories of objects and telling us perhaps things are more complicated than we might think. Those of us who spent our academic lives thinking about dress and fashion and clothes and material culture in general know this. We acknowledge the nature of objects and our utter entanglements with them. Objects are imbued with the lives of those whom they serve. They're nicked by incident, worn by habit, and they're warmed by touch. For me, clothes are the closest of all. Isn't it possible that what we are could in some way be dispersed through the stuff of the world? And that is why it warrants such close inspection. That is why it warrants experimental thinking about our past and our future too. I'm heading to the close of this lecture, so let me come back to right so I can try to draw things together a little bit, because I'm sure that you're thinking, how is all of this connected? I've been talking about the struggle to breathe. But this is a beautiful image too, it seems to me. And I want to remind you that people are catching their breath in this image for other reasons. The boy in the bottom left, keenly leaning in, is gasping with interest. And even the small girl tearfully trying to turn away, although she can't, she's gulping down her breaths, and yet she's captivated too by wonder, it seems to me, as well as fear. And in my own work, I've been trying to think about wonder, and in particular, the experiences of beauty and the wonder this inspires. I'm thinking a lot about the physiological responses to beauty. I start very often my work in this with this image, which is Oil on Linen, Amy Sherald's painting from 2018 of Michelle Obama, which is at the National Portrait Gallery at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington. And in it, Michelle Obama is like a mountain. She's magnificent against the flat blue wash of the background. The backdrop is redolent of an American folk art tradition. She sat, I think, rather than imposingly stood, and there is a kind of unstudied gracefulness in the angled crook of her arm that rests across her lap, and the very elegant hand that props up her head. It's the dress, though, that dominates the image. It is expansive, heavy, and brilliantly white. Its generous skirt amassing around the seated figure. The dress is modelled on an original halter neck cotton poplin gown from the spring 2017 collection of the American designer Michelle Smith and her US brand Millie. To my regret, I don't think I have that slide here. You can look up that dress, but you'll be able to see the resemblance to the US brand Millie from the spring 2017 collection. I am sorry that I haven't got it here. But this dress, Smith explained, was inspired by, this is a quote, by desire for equality in human rights, racial equality, and LGBTQ equality. The knots and ties in particular, she said, were meant to portray a feeling of being held back, that we're not quite there yet. For Sherald, the dress's geometric pattern was redolent both of the 20th century Dutch painter Piet Mondrian and the African-American artisanal quilting tradition of the Gee's Bend's women of Alabama. The quilting tradition in Gee's Bend seems to go back as far as the early 1800s, where the community was the site of a cotton plantation owned by a Joseph Gee. And it seems to have been influenced by the patterned textiles of Africa. The story is that the women slaves began piecing strips of cloth together to make bed covers. And through the postbellum years of tenant farming and well into the 20th century, Gee's Bend women made quilts to keep themselves and their children warm in unheated shacks that lacked running water and electricity. And along the way, they developed this very distinctive style, notable for its improvisations, its liveliness, and its simplicity. The other thing about this painting, it seems to me, is that it is an experimental painting about race. You might notice that the sitter's skin, as in many of Sherald's work, has an oddly grey tone. Sherald characteristically depicts black skin in many of her portraits in this shade of grey. The objective is, she explains, to exclude the idea of colour as race. And in these portraits, the black skin of the sitter does not only signify their blackness, it's capable of other kinds of meaning too. It seems to me to give the sitters a kind of phantasmic or wraith-like quality. So these are realistic portraits, but they're also given an unreal edge too. And I've been writing at length about them, and I'm looking forward to learning more about them. What I want to end by saying is that I find this portrait beautiful, and I want to end by talking a little bit about what beauty does. Beauty is an intellectual experience and a sensory, physiological one too. I describe it as an inward responsiveness to an outward stimulation, and it is an unmistakable arrangement of attention and effect, a way of understanding and engaging the world. When the literary critic Elaine Scarry investigated beauty in the late 90s, she noticed the contract between the beautiful object and those who recognize it as such. Each, she notes, confers the gift of life, welcoming the other. That's a rather cloying and vague expression, but I think there's something to it, the idea of a compact, the notion of a mutual realization that unfolds between us and the object of our attention when we are engaged in judgments of beauty. Something rises to challenge our perceptual faculties, and we rise in turn to meet it. The philosopher Alexander Nemes said of beauty that it creates a temporary kind of community, providing a space under which our collective thoughts gather. What is involved, he explains, is less a matter of understanding and more a matter of hope, of establishing a community that centers around it, a community, to be sure, whose boundaries are constantly shifting and whose edges are never stable. And this community is made possible, it seems to me, by our shared capacity for somatic and sensory response, a body that's plugged into a mind that's awakened to the world and responsive to its suggestions. For me, the beautiful is a kind of prickling around my shoulders. It's a tightening in my chest, sometimes a welling in my eyes. It can be a feeling of pain as well as pleasure, and it is very often a sharp intake of breath. The beautiful can feel expansive. It can feel like air inhaled, filling my lungs endlessly. When the portrait was unveiled in February 2018, thousands of visitors queued to view the images lining up at the gallery, including 2-year-old Parker Curry, adorably, who was photographed gazing up open-mouthed at Cheryl's portrait. And I love how in this image she is gazing up open-mouthed. I can hear her sharp intake of breath, that release of that gasp of wonder. And I'll stop there, Kat.
Thank you so much, Shahidha, for that fantastic lecture.